Welcome to Life Stories, where real journeys inspire hope and resilience. Today, we share the story of a woman who overcame heartbreak, humiliation, and years of self-doubt to rediscover her strength and rebuild her life. From walking away from a toxic marriage to finding love within herself and embracing new beginnings. Her journey is one of triumph and transformation. If you've ever felt trapped or lost, this story will remind you that it's never too late to start again. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's inspiring tale. I remember that evening as if it happened just yesterday. The air in the house felt heavy, though on the surface, it seemed like any other night. The sound of rain tapping against the windows was almost soothing, masking the storm that was about to erupt in my life. I stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, a routine I had performed countless times before. The hot steam fogged my glasses, and my hands trembled slightly, not from the heat, but from an emotion I could no longer ignore. Outside the kitchen, the laughter of my family drifted in from the living room. My husband, Mike, was at the center of it all, his voice rising above the others with that sharp, mocking tone he used so often. His words always carried a thin veneer of humor, but I knew them for what they were: barbs meant to cut, cloaked in sarcasm. Over the years, I had grown used to brushing off those comments, convincing myself they didn't matter. But that night was different. Something inside me was breaking, and I could feel it. As I carried the pot of soup to the dining table, I forced a smile. As I had done so many times before, I served everyone in silence, my movements mechanical, my heart heavy. My eldest daughter, Emily, noticed the tension in my face. She gave me a small, knowing look, but she didn't say a word. She knew better than to intervene when Mike was in one of his moods. The table was filled with voices and laughter, yet I felt utterly alone, as though I were a ghost haunting my own home. Mike raised his wine glass, that familiar smirk on his face. It was the kind of smile that always made my stomach churn, a harbinger of the cruelty he was about to unleash. "A toast," he announced, his voice commanding everyone's attention. "To patience," he said, his eyes sweeping the room before landing squarely on me. "I've been patient for years, haven't I? Trying to make things work. Trying to make her better." The words were like daggers, sharp and deliberate. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the table as I stared at him. He went on, his voice dripping with contempt. "But you know what? I can't do it anymore. Look at her. Ugly. Fat. A failure. I've wasted years trying to change her. And it's pointless." He turned to me then, his expression a mixture of disdain and false pity. "I want a divorce." The silence that followed was deafening. It was as though all the air had been sucked out of the room. I felt my world crumbling beneath me, the floor falling away as his words echoed in my mind. Ugly. Fat. Failure. Those words weren't new to me. They were the same whispers of doubt I had heard in my own head on countless lonely nights. But hearing them spoken aloud, in front of my family, made them feel 1,000 times heavier. A burden I could no longer bear. I glanced around the table, my vision blurred by tears I refused to let fall. Emily sat next to my mother, her face pale, her hands clenched in her lap. She wanted to say something, I could see it in her eyes, but she stayed silent, knowing that anything she said would only provoke Mike further. Mike, meanwhile, wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine lazily as if he hadn't just destroyed the very foundation of my life. "Well, Kate," he said, his smirk returning, "what do you have to say for yourself?" "Nothing. Figures." His voice was casual, almost amused, as though this were all a game to him. Something inside me snapped. Years of humiliation, of sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of keeping the peace, of putting his needs above my own, all came rushing to the surface. My hands trembled, but not with fear this time. It was something else, something I hadn't felt in years. Anger. Determination. Strength. I stood up slowly. The sound of my chair scraping against the floor cutting through the heavy silence. All eyes were on me, waiting for me to crumble, to break down as I had so many times before. But I didn't cry. And I didn't beg. Instead, I took a deep breath and looked Mike directly in the eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. "No, Mike," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I have nothing to say. I don't need to defend myself against your words anymore." His smirk faltered, replaced by a look of confusion. He wasn't used to this version of me, the one who refused to shrink under the weight of his insults. He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head as though to dismiss me. "Is that all? That's your big reaction?" I straightened my shoulders, my voice calm but firm. "If you want a divorce, then let's get divorced. But don't think for a second that it will break me. You broke me once before, Mike. But I survived. And this time, I'm making my own choices. Not you. Not anyone else." The room fell silent once more. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of realization, of the power shifting in ways Mike had never anticipated. For the first time in years, I felt the weight lifting from my shoulders, the chains he had wrapped around me falling away. I didn't stay to see his reaction. Without another word, I turned and walked away, stepping out into the cold night air. The rain soaked through my clothes, but I didn't care. In that moment, I knew something had changed forever. I wasn't the same woman I had been when I walked into that room. I had taken my first step toward a life that was truly mine. And I wasn't looking back. The cold night air hit my face as I stepped outside, rain soaking through my clothes almost instantly, but I welcomed it. It felt cleansing, as if the storm above was washing away the years of pain and humiliation I had endured. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe. My legs carried me forward on instinct alone, away from the house, away from Mike, and away from the life that had confined me. I walked with no destination in mind, my thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm. His words still echoed in my head. Sharp and cruel, ugly, fat, failure. But as the sound of the rain surrounded me, those words began to lose their grip. I wasn't walking away from just Mike, I was walking away from the version of myself that had believed him. After what felt like hours, I found myself standing in front of a small apartment building. It wasn't much, just a modest complex on a quiet street, but to me, it represented freedom. I had rented the apartment in secret a few months earlier, driven by a gnawing instinct that I might one day need it. That instinct had been right. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the key. When I finally stepped inside, the silence was overwhelming. No mocking comments, no critical stares, no suffocating presence, just peace. I stood there in the middle of the room, drenched and trembling, as the enormity of what had just happened began to sink in. I had left. I had walked away from the life I thought I was trapped in. And though the fear of what lay ahead was almost paralyzing, there was something else stirring within me, hope. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting a golden glow over the small living room. I sat on the edge of the sofa, clutching a cup of coffee and staring out the window at the city slowly coming to life. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so, but that quiet held a kind of promise. There were no insults or biting remarks to brace myself against. No tension simmering just beneath the surface. It was just me. I picked up my phone, my heart pounding as I dialed the number I had been avoiding for months. It was for a lawyer, a contact given to me by a friend who had gone through a similar situation. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, guiding me through the steps I needed to take. By the time I hung up, I had an appointment scheduled for later that week. It felt surreal, as though I were watching someone else's life unfold. But it was my life. For the first time in years, I was taking control of it. Later that day, my daughter Emily called. Her voice was hesitant, filled with worry. "Mom," she said softly, "where are you? Dad's been saying all kinds of things. And I need to know you're okay." Her concern brought tears to my eyes. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I assured her, though my voice wavered. "I just need some time to think, to figure things out." Emily was quiet for a moment before she spoke again. "Does this mean you're really going through with it? The divorce?" I closed my eyes, the weight of her question pressing down on me. "Yes, Emily," I said, my voice firm but gentle. "It's for the best. For all of us." Her sigh on the other end of the line was heavy with emotion. But her next words brought me a sense of relief I hadn't expected. "I understand, Mom. And I'm on your side. No matter what." Hearing that filled me with a strength I didn't know I had. For years, I had stayed in that marriage because I thought it was what my family needed. But now, I realized that the best thing I could do for Emily and for myself was to show her what it meant to stand up for your own worth. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of the day settled over me. I wasn't naive, I knew the road ahead would be difficult. Mike wouldn't make this easy, and there were bound to be moments when I would question my decision. But for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. I fell asleep with that thought in my mind, knowing that this was only the beginning. I had walked away, and there was no turning back. Whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. The following days passed in a blur of quiet determination. Each morning, I woke up in that small apartment and reminded myself that this was a fresh start. It wasn't easy. The echoes of my old life lingered like ghosts in the corners of my mind, whispering doubts and fears. But with every decision I made, every small step forward, I felt a little stronger. I started by focusing on the basics. My first task was to attend the meeting with the lawyer. The office, located downtown, was modest but professional. As I sat in the waiting area, clutching a folder of documents, my heart raced. This meeting felt like a declaration, a commitment to the new life I was building. When I was called into the office, the lawyer, Mr. Jameson, greeted me with a kind smile. He listened attentively as I explained my situation, nodding occasionally. "You're making a brave decision, Kate," he said when I finished. His words brought a strange mix of relief and sadness. Brave wasn't a word I had associated with myself in a long time, but hearing it from someone else gave me a small glimmer of hope. By the end of the meeting, I had signed the initial papers. My hands trembled as I wrote my name, but with each stroke of the pen, I felt the weight of my old life lifting. Walking out of that office, I felt lighter, as though I had taken a tangible step toward reclaiming myself. Emily came over that evening. She had been worried ever since our phone call, and seeing her standing in the doorway of my apartment brought tears to my eyes. She hugged me tightly, her embrace filled with a kind of love and understanding that words couldn't convey. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said softly. "I know this isn't easy, but you're doing what's right." We sat on the small sofa, talking late into the night. Emily told me how she had always seen the tension in my marriage with Mike. "Even as a child, you deserve to be happy," she said firmly. "You've spent so many years putting everyone else first. Now it's your turn." Her words stayed with me long after she left. For years, I had convinced myself that sacrificing my own happiness was the price of being a good wife and mother. But now, I realized that wasn't true. I could still be a good mother while choosing myself for a change. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose. I opened a notebook and began making a list, small goals that felt achievable but meaningful. I wrote things like start exercising, take a class, and reconnect with friends. The act of writing them down felt like planting seeds, tiny promises to myself that I was ready to grow. One of the first things I did was join a local community center that offered fitness classes. Walking into that room filled with strangers was intimidating. But I reminded myself that this was part of my journey. The instructor was a kind woman named Laura, who welcomed me with an encouraging smile. As the weeks went by, I began to feel the physical and emotional benefits of movement. Each stretch, each step, felt like a reclaiming of my body, a body that Mike had criticized but that I was learning to appreciate. I also rediscovered an old passion, writing. I had loved creative writing as a teenager, but it was a hobby I had abandoned long ago. Inspired by the idea of starting anew, I signed up for a beginner's creative writing class at a nearby library. The first session was nerve-wracking, but as I sat with my notebook, the words began to flow. Writing became a form of therapy, a way to process my emotions and give voice to the parts of me I had silenced for so long. Reconnecting with friends was perhaps the most emotional part of my journey. Mike had slowly isolated me from many of the people I cared about. But now, I was reaching out to them again. One afternoon, I met my old friend Rachel for coffee. We had grown up together. But over the years, life had pulled us in different directions. Sitting across from her, laughing and reminiscing, I felt a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Rachel told me she was proud of me, and her words felt like a balm on my wounded heart. Through these small steps, I began to see myself in a new light. I wasn't just someone who had survived a difficult marriage, I was someone who could thrive. Each decision, no matter how small, was a reminder that I had the power to shape my own future. By the end of those first few weeks, I had built a foundation for the life I wanted. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt and fear. But for the first time in years, I felt hopeful. This wasn't just a new chapter, it was a new book entirely. And I was ready to write it. The day the divorce was finalized felt surreal. Walking into Mr. Jameson's office that morning, I was prepared for the formality of signing the papers. But I wasn't prepared for the emotions that came with it. I wore a navy blue blazer and a pair of polished heels, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to remind myself of the strong, capable woman I was becoming. Mike was already seated in the conference room when I arrived. He looked up as I entered, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Surprise. Maybe even admiration. I could feel his gaze linger, taking in the changes I had made, the confidence in my posture, the brightness in my eyes. But I didn't let it affect me. I had spent too many years seeking his approval. And now, I realized I no longer needed it. The lawyer began reading the final terms of the divorce agreement. I listened carefully, my hands steady, my heart resolute. Mike, however, couldn't contain himself. He leaned forward, interrupting the proceedings. "Kate," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Are you really going through with this?" I looked at him, meeting his gaze directly. "Yes, Mike," I replied calmly. "This is what I want. There's no going back." He frowned, his voice growing desperate. "You're in the best shape of your life now. I made mistakes. I know. But we can start over. It's not too late." Once, those words might have moved me. I might have clung to the hope of reconciliation, of proving to him and to myself that our marriage could be salvaged. But now, I saw his words for what they were, a reaction to his loss of control. His sudden admiration wasn't about love, it was about power. About trying to reclaim what he thought he owned. "I don't think you understand, Mike," I said quietly but firmly. "This isn't about you anymore. This is about me. For years, I let your words define me. I believed I wasn't enough because you told me so. But I've learned something these past few months. I am enough. And I don't need your approval or anyone else's to see that." The room fell silent. Mike leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he looked at me not with contempt or control but with the realization that he had lost me forever. And I felt no hatred, no bitterness. I felt free. The lawyer resumed the proceedings. And before long, It was done. With a steady hand. I signed my name on the final line, sealing the end of my marriage. As I stood to leave, Mike remained seated, his eyes downcast. I didn't wait for him to speak. There was nothing left to say. Walking out of that office, I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. It wasn't just about leaving the marriage, it was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, my identity. For years, I had been defined by my role as Mike's wife, by the expectations and criticisms that came with it. But now, I was free to define myself on my own terms. That evening, Emily and I celebrated over dinner at a small Italian restaurant near my apartment. She raised her glass of sparkling water in a toast. "To you, Mom," she said, her voice full of pride. "For being brave. For standing up for yourself. And for showing me what it means to be strong." Her words brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, my voice trembling. "I couldn't have done this without you." In the weeks that followed, I began to embrace my newfound freedom. I poured myself into my creative writing class, finding joy in putting pen to paper and exploring the depths of my imagination. The stories I wrote weren't just about escape, they were about transformation. About discovering strength in vulnerability. And in those stories, I began to see reflections of myself. I also reconnected with old friends, people who had been pushed out of my life during my marriage. We spent afternoons catching up over coffee, sharing laughter and stories. One friend, Rachel, encouraged me to explore career opportunities, reminding me of the ambition and drive I had once possessed. Slowly but surely, I began to feel like myself again, not the version of me that Mike had tried to shape, but the real me. The me who had dreams and desires, who could stand tall and unapologetically take up space in the world. By the end of those weeks, I realized that my life wasn't just beginning anew, it was expanding. The world felt bigger, brighter, filled with possibilities I had never dared to imagine. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to embrace it. As the days turned into weeks, my newfound freedom felt both exhilarating and daunting. The apartment, once a quiet refuge, now felt alive with the possibilities of a future I had never dared to imagine. But even as I embraced this new chapter, the shadow of my past lingered. Mike had been silent since the divorce was finalized, but I knew him well enough to expect that the silence wouldn't last. It happened on a crisp autumn morning. I was sitting by the window, sipping coffee and jotting ideas for a short story, when my phone buzzed. The name on the screen made my heart skip. Mike. My first instinct was to ignore it, but a part of me felt that this confrontation was inevitable. The moment I answered, his voice filled the line. "Kate," he began, his tone unusually subdued. "I've been thinking about everything, and I need to say I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, heavy with years of unspoken regret. I stayed silent, letting him continue. He spoke of his mistakes, his realization that he had taken me for granted, and how he had ruined what we had. For a moment, his voice cracked, and I could hear the raw emotion he was trying to suppress. "I was wrong," he said finally. "I know I was. And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I needed you to hear it. I needed you to know." I closed my eyes, feeling a mix of emotions swirling inside me. There was no denying the sincerity in his voice. But I had spent too long waiting for an apology that I no longer needed. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm but firm. "Mike, I appreciate what you've said. But this isn't about forgiveness. This is about me moving forward. What we had is over, not because I hate you, but because I've learned to love myself. I hope you can move forward too." He was quiet for a moment before he spoke again, his tone tinged with sadness. "I understand," he said softly. I wish I had realized all of this sooner." After we hung up, I stared at the phone in my hand, a strange sense of closure washing over me. Mike's apology didn't erase the years of pain, But it felt like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. It wasn't about him anymore, it was about me. That afternoon, I decided to take a walk through the city. The crisp air was invigorating, and the trees lining the streets were ablaze with shades of orange and gold. As I wandered, I found myself drawn to a small bookstore I hadn't visited in years. Stepping inside, I was greeted by the comforting scent of paper and ink. One book caught my eye almost immediately, A Rebirth: How to Rebuild Your Life from the Ground Up. The title felt like a sign, a quiet reminder that I was on the right path. I bought it without hesitation, eager to explore its pages. Back in my apartment, I curled up on the sofa and began reading. The book spoke of letting go of the past, of embracing the unknown, and of the courage it takes to rebuild. Each word resonated deeply, as if it had been written just for me. Over the next few days, I found myself making small but meaningful changes. I started journaling every morning, capturing my thoughts and dreams. I revisited hobbies I had abandoned long ago, like painting and baking, and found joy in creating something with my own hands. I also began reconnecting with people from my past. One day, I met Deborah, an old colleague, for coffee. We hadn't seen each other in years, but the moment we sat down, it felt as if no time had passed. Deborah listened intently as I shared my journey, and when I mentioned my interest in writing, she smiled. "You've always had a way with words, Kate," she said warmly. "You should think about sharing your story. I think it could inspire a lot of people." Her words stayed with me long after we said goodbye. For the first time, I began to see my story not as a tale of pain and loss, but as one of resilience and growth. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The past had shaped me, yes, but it no longer defined me. I was free to embrace the future, whatever it might hold, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid. In the weeks that followed, my life began to take on a new rhythm, one defined by choice, joy, and discovery. For so many years, I had lived according to someone else's rules, confined by expectations that left no room for my own dreams. But now, I was learning to embrace a different way of being, one where I could shape my world instead of simply existing within it. The creative writing class I had joined quickly became a sanctuary. Each week, I walked into that library with a sense of anticipation, eager to share my words and hear those of others. The stories we wrote were raw and honest, filled with fragments of our lives. In every session, I saw reflections of my own journey in the experiences of my classmates, people who, like me, were searching for meaning, healing, and hope. My instructor, a soft-spoken woman named Ellen, encouraged us to dig deeper, to find the truth hidden within our words. One evening, as I read aloud a short piece I had written, Ellen stopped me mid-sentence. "There's so much strength in your voice, Kate," she said, her eyes warm. "You're not just telling a story, you're reclaiming it." Her words stayed with me long after class ended. She was right. Writing wasn't just an exercise for me, it was a way to rewrite my narrative, to take the pieces of my past and turn them into something meaningful. Outside of class, I continued to reconnect with the parts of myself I had lost. One afternoon, while organizing the small apartment I now called home, I came across a photo album from my 20s. There was a picture of me standing on a hiking trail, my face flushed from exertion but radiant with joy. It reminded me of how much I used to love being outdoors, of the sense of freedom and wonder that came with exploring new places. The next weekend, I laced up an old pair of hiking boots and drove to a nearby nature reserve. The trail was quiet, surrounded by towering trees whose leaves whispered in the breeze. As I walked, I felt the stress of the past months melt away, replaced by a sense of connection to the earth, to myself, to the moment. It was as if I were reclaiming not just my physical space but my inner one as well. Amid these transformations, an unexpected encounter began to unfold. I first met Eric at a networking event that my friend Deborah had invited me to. I wasn't particularly eager to go, but Deborah insisted, reminding me of the importance of building connections as I rebuilt my life. The event was held in a sleek downtown venue, filled with professionals engaged in lively conversation. As I navigated the crowd, I noticed Eric almost immediately. He was tall, with dark hair and a quiet confidence that made him stand out. Our eyes met briefly, but I looked away, feeling a little self-conscious. Later, as I stood by the refreshment table, he approached me. "Hi," he said with a warm smile, extending his hand. "I'm Eric. I couldn't help but notice you seem as overwhelmed by all of this as I am." His humor disarmed me, and I found myself smiling back. "You're not wrong," I replied, shaking his hand. "I'm Kate." What began as a light-hearted conversation soon turned into something deeper. Eric listened intently as I spoke, his questions thoughtful and genuine. He shared his own experiences, his love of travel, his passion for photography, and in return, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected. There was no pressure, no pretense, just a sense of ease that felt rare and precious. By the end of the evening, Eric asked if I'd like to meet for coffee sometime. His sincerity was evident. And though I was cautious, I said yes. There was something about him, a kindness, an authenticity that made me feel safe. As our conversations continued in the weeks that followed, I realized that Eric saw me for who I truly was. He wasn't interested in fixing me or changing me. He simply appreciated me as I was, a woman who had faced challenges, who had grown from them, and who was learning to embrace life on her own terms. One evening, as we walked along a quiet street, Eric turned to me and said, "You have this light about you, Kate. It's like you've been through the fire, and instead of being consumed by it, you came out shining brighter." His words took my breath away. For so long, I had defined myself by my scars, by the pain I had endured. But in that moment, I realized that those scars were part of my story, not the whole of it. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. Eric's presence in my life was a gift, but it wasn't the only source of my strength. I had found that strength within myself, in the choices I had made, in the steps I had taken toward a future I could finally call my own. And for the first time in years, I felt whole. In the end, my journey was never about finding someone new or seeking validation from others, it was about rediscovering myself. Through every challenge, I found strength I never knew I had. And through every tear, I learned the value of my own worth. Eric became a part of my story, but he wasn't the one who saved me. I saved myself. Standing on the beach one quiet evening, the waves lapping gently against the shore, I realized I was no longer defined by my past. The scars that once felt heavy now served as reminders of my resilience. My story wasn't one of loss, it was one of triumph, of reclaiming freedom, dignity, and joy. This is my journey of transformation, and I hope it inspires you to embrace your own. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories for more heartfelt journeys. See you in the next video.